On today's episode of Locked On Pistons podcast, we're going to be getting some insight from outside of Detroit, an outside Detroit perspective on whether Cade Cunningham is still franchise worthy. Is the young core still worthy of being built around? And how does Detroit get out of the mess that they are in right now? We'll talk about all that in today's episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I'm your host, Kuka Hill. You can find me over on Twitter at Kuka Hill. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button. We are just 100 subscribers, somewhere around there from 8,000 subscribers. So please, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Or as always, you can leave a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. We are recording this episode right ahead of the Detroit Pistons game against the Phoenix Suns. This is a day after their loss to the Los Angeles Lakers. And thankfully, I am lucky enough to be joined by Jackson Frank. You can find him over on Twitter at JackFrank_JJF. He is a writer over at Basketball Insiders. If you follow him on Twitter, which I'm assuming a lot of you guys probably do, he's a great follow for Basketball Insight. He's been at many, many different places. I'm sure you've seen some of his work. He's a very smart basketball writer, basketball media member. He does some great work. So Jackson, thank you for taking time out of your day to come on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate the kind words and excited to talk about a Pistons team that's been remade over the last month or so, if you include the first trade they made with the Wizards.
Right, and we've talked about that a lot on the podcast. I don't know if I've witnessed, we've had some people on the podcast compare it to kind of what the Minnesota Timberwolves did a few years ago, maybe a little bit to how the Atlanta Hawks did a few years ago as well. There's a completely revamp of the roster. The Pistons added 8 new players, got rid of 8 players, not including the players they had to waive in the process of trades to make them go through. If you count those, it even goes higher. So it's completely, it really is truly a completely new roster around their young core, which is where I want to start first with you. Before the season, and I don't know where you stand. I don't remember exactly where you stand on it. But before the season, I felt like I saw from a lot of people outside Detroit, a lot of people loved the Pistons young core. A lot of people thought the Pistons young core was bright. They had a bright future. And maybe they wouldn't be great, obviously, right now or maybe next year, but they were building towards something with this young core and had an impressive one. I saw a lot of debate about who has the best young core. Is it San Antonio now with Wemby? Is it Houston? And Detroit was obviously in there. So I just want to ask you, obviously this season has not gone according to plan at all. Is the young core still impressive to you, or have you moved off of where you were before the season? Where's your standing with the young core?
Well, I think they're in an interesting spot because when I think of the young core, I consider their core 4 to me is Cade, Jaden Ivey, Ausar Thompson, and Jalen Duren. You can throw Isaiah Stewart in there, but I'm a little lower on him. And I think he's played one more year than at least everyone besides Cade, and Cade even missed a year. So he's had a lot more time to get his feet wet. I like all of those players individually, different degrees. I think part of the problem is offensively, you have so little 3-point volume. You've seen Jaden Ivey take a lot of threes the last few weeks. Obviously, I think it was 7 for 7 against the Blazers last week. And I like his long-term projection, but he's also a guy you want to get downhill a lot. I think Cade's a guy who you can bank on being a pretty solid shooter, but you want him in the paint, generating paint touches, getting that mid-range, finding Jalen Duren for lobs. Obviously, Jalen's not much of a shooter. Ausar Thompson's a guy you want getting downhill as well. So I just wonder a little bit about kind of the long-term congruency of that group, but individually I like all of them. And so it feels like over the next, I would say by the end of next season, so everyone would have at least 2 full years under their belt, 3, for Cade, obviously missed 1 year. So that's when you really kind of have to start to know who's maybe your top 2 or 3 of that group. I know it's been kind of a long, arduous rebuild for the Pistons. They put themselves in a bit of a tough spot by not getting much back for their playoff core the last time they made the playoffs. So then obviously Killian Hayes didn't work out for them, their first lottery pick of that kind of the rebuild era. So I like their core 4 individually, but I just wonder offensively about kind of how you can go about maximizing them. And it does require Jaden Ivey to be a really good or really high volume. 3-point shooter, and I don't think that's necessarily something he can't do, but it takes away from what he does best. And then similarly with Cade, so I just kind of wonder where they're at in a year from now, by the end of this season, even. So that's how I feel about them, and I am really fascinated to kind of see what they look like by the start of next season, and kind of and everything there, and how they look to kind of remake the roster and address some needs in the offseason. But I do like each of them individually at the very least.
So just to give you some background where I've stood on this team, going all the way back to the draft, who I wanted the Pistons to select at the 5th overall pick was indeed Ausar Thompson. I thought he was the best prospect. There are fair questions about whether he would fit because of the shooting. I was a little bit higher on his shooting coming into the NBA because they shot from an NBA 3-point range over in the OTE, and it wasn't like he shot amazing, but he shot around like 30%. Especially at the end of the year, he shot like 37% or something on self-created looks too. So I was a little bit more. I was higher on his 3-point shot. I don't know how he shoots. He's shooting like this bad at the NBA, figuring they shot the same range. So it's a little confusing to me. But obviously, I'm a little lower on it, probably a lot lower on it now. But at the time, I wanted Ausar Thompson with this team. I thought that was the right pick, and that's what obviously the direction they went. And on draft night, Troy Weaver and Ausar Thompson both said something that I think I mentioned on the podcast a few times, but it was their idea of the team moving forward. And they were asked about, does Ausar provide, shooting? You need spacing around Cade. You need spacing around J.I. Like, is Ausar really going to help with that? And Ausar and Weaver both went out of their way to say, the NBA, we're going to an era where it's about having multiple playmakers, multiple ball handlers on a floor that can attack gaps and create looks for other people. They brought up Denver, you brought up Boston. And really, if you look at a lot of the great teams in the NBA, the very top teams, obviously they have MVP caliber players. But outside of that, too, you have a lot of guys who are capable of, I think Boston is a really good example of this, too. A lot of guys are able to attack gaps off rotations and continue to keep the ball moving and create for themselves, but also create for guys and process it really quickly, which is kind of like the idea it sounded like from what Weaver said and Ausar was their idea around this team. Now, as this season has gone on, I think a lot of people are asking the same questions that you brought up, and I've brought it up myself even on the podcast. I'm not as convinced that the core four can fit together because of, the lack of volume 3-point wise. Like, you can love all the playmaking, the ability to attack gaps and create and everything, but at the end of the day, you do have to have a basic or a level of 3-point volume to be in the year of 2024. You have to have a certain level of that to succeed. So go ahead.
And I think that's kind of what's interesting about the Pistons is I don't think like any of their 5, if you want to say like 5 or 6 picks, if you want to even include the Killian and Beef Stew in there, like I don't think necessarily were bad picks. I know Killian struggled, but I think some of that you can also attribute to the injury that he suffered as a rookie. I'm not saying that's the only reason he didn't pan out, but I don't think it was a terrible pick. I think Beef Stew was was a good value outside the lottery. He's proven to be a good rotation player at the very least. Cade, if you want to say they should have gone Mobley, something like that, like that's okay. But I don't think that's necessarily changing like where this team is right now. I think Mobley is very good, but and then you look at Jaden Ivey was a very good pick at 4 for I think he was 4 or 5.
Right.
Like that, and he's proven he's coming along swimmingly in his second year. And Ausar, despite the outside shooting woes, is giving a lot of what you described. He is playing off of gaps really well. I think like the way he scored against the Lakers on Monday or Tuesday night was like a great example of it. Hit one corner 3, but a lot of it was the roll man stuff, transition. A couple of drives when he had open windows to get downhill. So that's what's tough about it is like I don't necessarily you could think any of these picks were disastrous. If you want to say the Killian one is, I can get that. But like the last 3 drafts, they've made good picks. They've done kind of the BPA, the best player available type of thing, which is a lot of people say you don't draft for fit, you draft for talent. It just is that maybe they've leaned even way too far into that in the sense that like if there was a toss between 2 prospects, maybe the one that projected to be a really good and versatile shooter and a high volume shooter might have been the way to go. But I don't think there was that sort of thing there, right? Like if somehow Keegan Murray might have ended up available, at 4 or 5 whenever Jaden was available, then maybe that's one that you could talk about. But he wasn't available. The Kings took him. So and Jalen Duren, even if he's a little undersized at center, has done a lot of good stuff in his first 2 years. So it's just a tough spot to be, and that's the tricky part about rebuilds. I think even a team like the Magic, they're obviously in a different stage of their rebuild. and are playing much better than the Pistons, they have their own kind of issues with the 3-point volume at times. So and I would say that's a big issue for them, while they aren't, more of a top 5 or 6 team rather than flirting with a play-in spot. So it's a really tricky thing to navigate. It doesn't mean that the Pistons front office hasn't made mistakes. But when you look at kind of their core group, you'd say they're all on track to be pretty good players and deliver pretty good value, but where they're picked. But that's not, that's not the only way you can. That's not the only thing that matters, I should say, when it comes to building a winner and kind of building a core up naturally.
So before we move on, just get a quick answer from you on this. This is something that's being talked about a lot in the Pistons community. It's after every game, during every game, before every game. It's being talked about nonstop, and for good reason. The season's been that bad to where this is what happens. If you had to, I don't know if you're a betting man, but if you had to put your money on this, do you think they have to break up these 4 guys eventually, like soon, within the next year? Move off one of Ausar, Cade, Ivey, or Duren. That's one. And 2, should they have to make a decision based on that core 4, like splitting them up or keeping them within the next year, or should they be waiting longer?
I think in terms of practicality, I would be waiting longer, but the reality is this front office doesn't probably get another year and a half to determine that. So I would be surprised if all 4 of these guys were Pistons past next year's trade deadline, assuming like they don't clean house, this summer, because that's kind of the issue, right? Is that because and I don't recall exactly when Trevor was hired in this group was hired, but because they didn't really do well to kind of use their playoff core, with Drummond and Griffin and Reggie Jackson and that group, because they didn't really do well to kind of use what value those guys had in the trade market to launch a rebuild. They started from to a flat baseline, and the first guy they took, and Killian Hayes, didn't work out. So you just don't really he doesn't really work that way. So I think they'll have to trade one of them at some point, but I do think it's too rash to do something before the end of next season, but I would expect them to happen before the end of next season, assuming that Troy Weaver and kind of his front office group is still in charge, which is a bummer because I think, like I said, all of them have shown encouraging flashes. All of them have fewer than 2 full years of NBA experience under their belt in terms of games played. I would say, I think the most is probably, a year and a half for them or so, because they've all kind of had some different nicks and knacks with injuries. So, or are rookies like in Asar's case. So, yeah, I would bank on it, but I do think it would be a mistake. But I also don't think it's like some sort of terrible mistake, just because, like we mentioned, like there is a baseline level of spacing that you need, and in horizontal spacing, in terms of 3-point shooting, isn't the only way to create spacing, but you do need some of it. And the Pistons tried to address that in the offseason, going to get guys like Monte Morris and Joe Harris, and trading for Bogdan Bogdanovic the years prior, and signing or trading for Alec Burks at some point. But obviously, Joe Harris didn't work out. Monte didn't look good when he was healthy and was barely healthy here. So it's a tough spot to be. But yeah, I would bank on this core not being together for more than another year, when I think it would be a mistake, but not one that's like the worst thing the Pistons could do. I understand why it would be a decision they have to confront.
All right, fair enough. So we'll probably come back to that a little bit in this upcoming segment. We'll talk about all this stuff, all the core 4 stuff, adding around them, like all that is important, obviously. But if we're all being honest, none of that is going to matter if Cade is not the franchise guy. If Cade is not what people expected him to be coming out of college, it's going to be tough for Detroit. So I'm going to ask Jackson. We'll have this conversation coming up. Is Cade still worthy of being the franchise player for the Detroit Pistons? But before we get into any of that, did you know that even if you have a 401k for retirement, you can still have an IRA? Robinhood has the only IRA that gives you a 3% boost on every dollar you contribute when you subscribe to Robinhood Gold. But get this, now through April 30th, Robinhood is even boosting every single dollar you transfer in from other retirement accounts with a 3% match. That's right, no cap on the 3% match. Robinhood Gold gets you the most of your retirement thanks to their IRA with a 3% match. This offer is good through April 30th. Get started at Robinhood.com/boost. Subscription fees apply. And now for some legal info. Claim as of Q1 2024, validated by Radius Global Market Research. Investing involves risk, including loss. Limitations apply to IRAs A and 401ks. 3% match requires Robinhood Go for 1 year from the date of the first 3% match. Must keep Robinhood IRA for 5 years. The 3% matching on transfers is subject to specific terms and conditions. Robinhood IRA available to U.S. customers in good standing. Robinhood Financial LLC is a registered broker dealer. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. All right, Jackson. So I'm sure we'll revisit some of what you said in the first segment with this segment, what we're going to talk about here. At the end of the day, I like Ausar. Like everything you said, I really do agree with. Individually, I like all of these players. And whether they can fit or not, and whether they'll reach their potential, there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. But I think at the end of the day, the main thing that goes into whether this Pistons rebuild goes right is if their number one overall pick, Cade Cunningham, is worthy of number one overall pick and is worthy of being their franchise player. I think this is a conversation that a lot of people outside Detroit, from what I've seen, not very many people seem to believe he is that. And after this season in Detroit, I think there's still a lot of people in Detroit that believe he is. But even after this type of season, seeing how bad it's went, there has been a few people like, man, if you're a franchise player, could it really get this bad? So just where do you stand right now? I know Cade, I'm going to take a guess. I think I remember, but I'm not sure. I'm going to take a guess. I believe you were pretty high on Cade. I think a lot of people on NBA Twitter were very high on Cade from what I've seen. But where do you stand on Cade Cunningham now?
Yeah, I think when he was drafted, I felt really, really optimistic about him, just having watched a lot of him at Oklahoma State, watching him at Montverde, watching him with the Texas Titans. I think this was his AAU team in high school. And I would say I've gotten a little lower, but I wouldn't say it's like drastically. I'd say I felt as though he was a guy who could be a top 5 player in the league. Now it feels more of top 15 to 20 would be his peak. Maybe a few seasons at top 10, but not kind of a guy you would consistently put firmly in the top 10 in his peak, or I would say throughout his prime more. But the big thing is that he and the Pistons have to find a way to get him easier looks, I think. Because there's a lot of stuff that Cade is very comfortable with, right? He's really good using screen, setting them up with his pacing and his footwork. He and Duren have a really nice two-man game together. Some of the different angles he can throw lobs to Duren, or find him for lay down passes, wraparound passes around the paint, around the hoop rim are impressive. He's pretty good creating space for himself in the mid-range, can get to the basket a lot, but he's not a very forceful driver or finisher. Hasn't been above 60% at the rim in any of his, I guess, 3 years. It's hard to call last year much of a season, but I think his rookie year was at 58% around the rim, which is cleaning the glass, calls it anything within 4 feet. Is at 58% again this year. I know there are spacing concerns, but those both rank below the 30th percentile among wings in the NBA. And I know the creation burden is big, but you've just got to be better than that if you're going to get downhill a lot. He's got some craft, but just feels like a lot of times when he does attack, he is not winning the war of momentum, if that's what you want to call it, against a rim protector, against a help defender, and he's pushed off a spot, or isn't quite having the level of touch that he like when he finishes stuff. So the craft is there, the pacing's there, but he's not drawing many fouls. I think I saw a tweet or a quote, from Troy Brown Jr. last week, kind of telling him Cade about a way to better play off 2 feet or 1 foot. And I thought that was really insightful. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was something about just trying to help Cade either become a better finisher or draw more fouls when he gets downhill. And that's, to me, that's kind of the crux of it, right? Because Cade loves to play in the mid-range. His mid-range frequency has always been at worst in the 83rd percentile. This year is 95th percentile. About 45% of his shots are there. And when you think about some of the biggest mid-range guys in the league, you think about a KD, you think about a Joel Embiid, you think about DeMar DeRozan, CJ McCollum is a guy that I think has often been a mid-range player. And those are all guys who had really efficient scoring seasons before. And Cade hasn't yet. And again, it's early. in his career, but they all either have one of three things. They're either a great mid-range scorer like KD and Joel are, they're a great or a great foul baiter like DeMar and Joel are, or they're a great three-point shooter like KD and CJ are. And that's not anything that fits Cade's shooting profile at this point. So it is true that guys, as they get older and develop, kind of just become better shot makers, whether it's because they find just little ways to become more comfortable in the spots they're at or create a little more space, and that's something that Cade's gonna have to do. He's really cleaned up the turnovers over the last couple of months too, which has been really important. That assist to turnover ratio is never the end all be all, but just watching the games, you could tell that he was making a lot of sloppy passes. Like the ideas were there, but he wasn't quite kind of fully committed to them. That feels like he's kind of ironed some of that out of his game, which is important. And you can see a lot of the defensive flashes both on and off the ball. Still not super consistent to me, but you can really see when he makes a good rotation, fighting around a screen off the ball or providing help on a drive. At the point of attack, he applies good pressure with his size. So that side of the ball for me is him kind of putting together a full season because the versatile flashes are really impressive, but I don't feel like every time I tune in to watch Cade and the Pistons that he's making a big difference on that end. So there's a lot that Cade does really well. I think he's a very good basketball player, but I just need for him to kind of find ways to become a really efficient scorer and a little more consistent defender because I like kind of the tools he has, but it just hasn't quite been there yet. So to me, he feels like a guy who might cap out as like a great, great, great number two on a title team. Maybe not quite a number one, just because of kind of the way that he approaches scoring and the way kind of he likes to get to certain spots that aren't necessarily the most efficient on the floor, and he isn't great from the most efficient spots on the floor right now. So a bit of a ramble, but that's kind of how I feel on Cade. So pretty optimistic. He's clearly turned a corner, I would say, from the early part of the year when his efficiency was terrible, but it hasn't since he come back from injury. The last 7 or 8 games he's played, it hasn't been quite as dynamic from that. I think December run was when he was really, really good. When they rattled off, that win against the Raptors and he had some big games against the Celtics and a couple other teams. So that's how I feel about Cade. So still pretty optimistic, but definitely some stuff that he's going to have to figure out to really maximize his star or superstar level ceiling.
Yeah, I think everything you said is really fair, and it's this is the problem. This is why this is such a big argument in the Pistons community, and it goes all the way back to his rookie season. You mentioned his finishing, and a lot of people have truly felt like that the Pistons just have not built around him good at all. They don't feel like they put a lot of spacing around him and made a lot of his driving lanes pretty small. Made a lot of it, which therefore makes a lot of his finishes a little bit tougher than maybe they could be. I know like his rookie season B-ball index. I don't know exactly what goes into their formula, how they get to it, but they rated him as like one of the I believe the best rookie guard finisher over the last 10 years when you take into a degree of difficulty and spacing around that. Don't know how much to read into that, but a lot of when I see Cade, I still feel like I was really high on Cade. I'm still very high on him. I think he can be the Pistons franchise player still. You mentioned the run he had it was around November 17th through January, the beginning of January, before he got hurt in that Denver game. During that stretch of 24 games, averaging 24, 7.2 assists, 4.3 rebounds on 47, 36, 87 splits. Like if he averaged that for his entire season this year, I think everyone would be ecstatic about him. But like you said, since he had another knee injury happen, and he missed for a few weeks, and then ever since he's come back, he hasn't looked at that level. And that's something Pistons fans have gotten accustomed to, that when Cade goes down with an injury, even if it's just a ticky-tack injury, it usually takes him a minute before he ramps back up. He usually starts a little slow. So that's the hope, is that he's just he's rounding back into it, and he looks like that guy again for those 2 months during this season where it looked like he was making that turn into, hey, this is the number one overall guy. But I think where I stand with it, and I would say most Pistons fans stand with it, is that he has things he has to improve on for sure. I don't think the three-point shooting is at where a lot of people thought it would be coming out of college. But I think a lot of people agree that he's also probably been – I have to go through it, but we've talked about it a lot. Like, how many number one overall picks I feel like have been built around worse than Cade? I can't think of many. He's been –
I mean, it's tough. Like I just think of the most recent ones that go back to Luka. I mean, they've they've at least had pretty good like NBA caliber talent around. Traded for a couple stars and Porzingis and Kyrie. 2019, Zion's always had really good talent around him, even if the spacing hasn't been great. He's had guys like Ingram and McCollum and Jonas Valanciunas, Lonzo before the sign and trade. 2020, Anthony Edwards has always had, they weren't great his rookie year, but he always had someone like Karl-Anthony Towns. Now they have Gobert. They've built really well. 2022, Paolo's, there's some issues for Paolo too, but I'm sure that Cade would love to have a player of Franz Wagner's caliber on his side. So, and I think Jamal Mosley's also done a really good job in terms of the coaching. Monty.
They've also kind of identified their identity. They have big wings, they have big versatile centers, and they're a really good defensive team. Whereas the Pistons seem like they're just like you said in the first segment, just kind of throwing like best player available at the wall over and over and over and seeing what sticks.
Yeah, and then with Wemby, it's too they haven't had a draft to build around him yet, so it's too early to say. So, and then 2017, Fultz was the first pick. They already had Embiid, they already had Ben Simmons. So, yeah, I don't think there's been a pick in recent memory that's had worse like infrastructure, whether that's the talent, the coaching, the front office, because even if you look at like Wemby, you could say that the front office is very cohesive with a vision for what it wants, and it has Popovich there, who I think is doing a really good job building up that group of young guys around Wemby and Wemby himself. So yeah, and that's not to excuse everything that Cade has to figure out, but clearly there's a lot working against him that players of the last 6-7 years drafted first overall has not had to endure. That's for sure.
All right, so we'll leave it there. Let me know in the comment section down below, or on Twitter. You can let me know at Kuka Hill or Jackson over at Jack Frank JJF. Do you think Cade is the franchise player for the Detroit Pistons? Is he progressing along? Just give me your thoughts on where you guys stand with that. Coming up, though, how does Detroit get out of where they're at? Are they stuck here? Is it time to just blow it up? How exactly does Detroit talk about that or get out of this situation they're in? We'll talk about that coming up. But before we get to that topic of discussion, gotta tell you guys about Hungry Root. Hungry Root is your partner in healthy living. It's the easiest way to get fresh, high-quality groceries and simple, healthy recipes delivered to your door. Take a fun, short quiz, and Hungry Root will get to know your personal health goals, what you like to eat, the kitchen appliances you use, and more. Then they'll build you a personalized cart with all your grocery needs for the week and give you delicious recipe recommendations to put those groceries to good use. Hungry Root will recommend recipes and groceries based on your personal taste, but each order is fully customizable. Take their suggestions or choose anything that you want. They've got fresh produce, high-quality meat and seafood, pantry staples, healthy snacks and sweets, ready-to-eat meals, and much more. Everything from Hungry Root follows a simple standard. It's gotta taste good, be quick to make, and contain whole, trusted ingredients. Save hours planning, shopping, and cooking. Hungry Root delivers food that you will love. Right now, Hungry Root is offering Locked On Pistons listeners 40% off your first delivery and free veggies for life. Just go to hungryroot.com/lockedon to get 40% off your first delivery and get your free veggies for life. That's hungryroot.com/lockedon. Don't forget to use our link so they know that we sent you. Again, that's hungryroot.com/lockedon. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. This podcast has went a little bit longer than expected. That usually is what happens, Jackson. I don't know how many other Locked On podcasts you've done, but every time I get a guest on here, it goes a little longer. It's just so hard to fit like a back and forth in 30 minutes. It's tough to do it. So We'll try to get this thing wrapped up as quick as possible. But last thing I want to talk with Jackson about, who, again, I want to thank you for coming on and making time out of your day. I know you're a busy guy. How does Detroit get out of this position? We've talked about how bad their season's been. You talk about the questions around their young core now, whether they are guys that can fit together and move forward. We've talked about whether Cade is the franchise guy. We talked about how badly him compared to other recent first overall picks, how badly his situation has been. And now, before these trades last month, which they've looked better over the last month, they're not good, but they look better than the worst team ever, which is like the pace they were on before those trades. They were fighting the 1973 Sixers for the worst record ever. In the midst of all that, that really pushes the question. And, you've asked about Troy Weaver's, his job earlier in the podcast, but it asks the overall question: can and how does Detroit get out of this? And are they still on, whether it was really bumpy and there was a bunch of potholes, are they still on the right road to restoring the Pistons to where they were for basically my entire childhood? Is there a way? Are they still on that right path? Where do you stand with this?
Yeah, I mean, I liked their deadline. I thought, part of their issue immediately after that first trade that they made that landed them Gallinari and Muscala was the rotation was very good for space around its stars, but like every space in the rotation was a pretty dreadful defender. Whether that was Muscala, Gallo, Bogdan, Alec Burks, and that made it tough to field any sort of formidable defense. So even if the offense looked better than the product itself looked better, they had some competent games, some really like competitive games against good teams. But they didn't really have a chance of getting sort of stopped. You can tell that with the trade for Simone Fontecchio and Quentin Grimes, those are two-way guys that can space the floor well, take a ton of threes, can do a little bit off the bounce too, so they're not just stationary spot up guys. That's kind of the archetype everybody wants, right? The floor spacer who can defend. But that's exactly what they need to keep targeting, just two-way guys. I think that are legit spacers. And I think if you have to sacrifice a little bit of the defense to get more volume shooting around your stars, guys that can amplify, Cade and Jaden and Jalen Duren and Ausar, that's okay because ideally, right, at least three of those guys, three of your core are really high level defenders. And Ausar, Cade, and Jalen Duren. I know Jalen, I don't know how you feel, but for me, I felt like he's been a little up and down this year on that end. And he is also working from a size deficit. He's just much smaller than a lot of centers. It hurts his ability to contest shots. It hurts his ability to cover ground like other centers do, especially ones that are 7 feet and above. So he's in a tough spot there. But that's kind of the way for them to get out. I think to continue making moves like the ones they made immediately at the deadline last week. And it's easier said than done. You're not going to find a Quentin Grimes, a young 3-and-D player who was very impressive last year for the Knicks. And they're on their way to a second round appearance in the playoffs. So, but I really like those two moves. Simone is a restricted free agent after this year, but restricted free agency, you hold all the cards in your hand in terms of kind of wanting a guy to stay or leave. Grimes is due for an extension. I think he's extension eligible after the season, but you hope that he can come back soon. I think it's a knee sprain or something like that. Or knee contusion, something like that. You hope he can come back and kind of get integrated over the last 20, 25 games of the season post All-Star break. So I like those moves. That's kind of where you need to keep going. I think finding a legit backup center now would be good. I thought Wiseman was okay yesterday against the Lakers, but on the whole, it's been a tough year for him. And Muscala isn't really any sort of playable center because you can't switch him, you can't play drop. So I would say finding a floor spacing center would be really nice for them. I know there's kind of been a lot of emphasis to make Beef Stew into this floor spacing four / floor spacing backup 5. I just don't know if he's ever going to get there. I don't know if the ball skills are good enough to get there either. I know they already signed this guy, but I wonder if they make another run at Kelly Olynyk this offseason. I think he's a free agent. I think he would be a nice backup for them. And he did help, a lot when he was there. But at the same time, I thought Bogdan helped a good amount, even though he wasn't as good this year. He still gave him a lot of spacing and self-creation and whatnot. So that's kind of what I would be targeting, is just guys that you can trust to hold their own defensively. I don't know if Olynyk can do that, but in general, guys, you're going to play big minutes around your core 4. And shuffle lineups in and out would be important. It's been interesting. I feel like Monty has tried to play the core more lately, but it's also led to a lot of bench lineups that don't have a lot of viable rotation players. The all bench lineups or bench heavy lineups, that makes it tough. So, and I think, I've been critical of Monty. I think a lot of people have. I think he's done some good stuff for them. I understand why it's tough to kind of it's tough. You want to see what your core has, but you also don't want to just tank the minutes without your core because the core isn't a bunch of positive impact players yet. So, it's not a great spot for Detroit to be in, but I like the vision of what they've done. With these last few moves, I can tell they're really stressing the importance of amplifying their best players. It's been some hit or miss stuff. I mean, they already cut Gallinari. Muscala, you can tell, is a guy that I think Monty doesn't love playing a ton because of the defensive issues, but also recognizes the spacing that he brings as a 5 or a 4. So I've been encouraged by some of the moves they've made the last month or so. But at the same time, it is the identical front office that's been in charge for 3.5 years. So maybe longer. I don't know. Again, I don't recall exactly when the Weaver era started, but it does seem like there's at least been some sort of shift in kind of the priorities around the decision making. So the hope should be that for that continue into the off season, and they can maybe find some legit vet level talent, not guys like Monty and Joe Harris. Like I said, I liked those moves in the offseason, but Joe just had nothing left, unfortunately, and Monty got injured, and we'll see if he kind of finds his own form in Minnesota. But um, it was a tough couple moves that looked good on paper, but didn't work out. And I think that's somewhat the saying for the Pistons right now is moves that look good on paper but don't work out. That's not to say they're in dire straits, but it's kind of how it's gone so far.
So I mean, we're at 36 minutes, and we gotta wrap this up soon. But I could ask you so many more questions. I wanted to ask you 3 more questions, but I'll ask you just one more, my most important one, because there was a few things I wanted to get your thoughts on. But maybe in the future we'll get some more thoughts from you on it. This is one question I really want to get your perspective on, and then we'll wrap it up. Don't want to stay too long, but there's a lot of conversation around. Let me just present like this. My thoughts are, if your core 4 can't play together in a lineup and that enables each other, if they can't fit together where you can play them long stretches and you play well because they play off of each other and they can play well, you have to move on. That is my opinion. I know a lot of people believe, well, you can just bring one off the bench. You can just, you can keep one away from the other 3, et cetera, et cetera. If that's your core 4 guys and you're having to do that because you don't believe they can play together, then they shouldn't be your core guys. That's my opinion. You need to move off of one. Your core guys need to be able to play together. If you're going through all these efforts to keep them away from each other because they can't fit, I think that's a problem. Where do you stand with that? Basically, do you believe that, like we mentioned with the Cade, Ivey, Ausar, Duren, do you think they need to be, when you have a core guys like that, if you have a core 4 or core 3, whatever, like those guys need to be able to play together? Or do you think, it is what, if one has to come off the bench, if you need to keep one away, those guys can still be confirmed, like referred to being your guys, your team's core, even if they don't fit together? Where do you stand on that kind of argument? And then we'll wrap up the podcast.
Yeah, I think you're correct. I think you look at some of the best cores or duos of the past, I would say currently, or even the past 5 years. I mean, look at Denver's young drafted core. We'll say just Jokic, Murray, and MPJ. You can throw Gordon in there, but he was traded for. They all work together at their best together, right? You look at OKC, Chet, SGA, and Jalen Williams. They all work at their best together. You look at the Celtics. If you want to say Jalen and Jason, you could throw Marcus Smart in there before they traded him. They all work at their best together. You look at him at the Sixers, right before, Ben Simmons, Joel Embiid worked well together, but they traded Simmons for James Harden, who worked beautifully alongside Embiid and Maxey. Now Maxey and Embiid work really well. So it's a really tough argument to the one that you were kind of talking against, right? That like, oh, you just bench them and things like that. And I think it's something the Cavs are trying to figure out. The Cavs have been really, really good lately, but you still kind of have some questions, right, about kind of Mobley and Allen together. I know the numbers are good, but they've really been staggering them since Mobley came back. So yeah, I absolutely would agree with you, and it's something that I think Detroit has to figure out over the next, what they got, 29 games left or something like that. And I think if they don't feel confident that this group could grow into something like that, then they would have to, I would say, make a pretty aggressive move this offseason. They feel as though things are trending in the right direction over the last, 30 game. Once they have kind of this group intact, then maybe you give it another shot. But yeah, absolutely, you can't really like stagger guys like that. I mean, you can, but that's more because I think when you stagger guys, to me, the idea of is bringing up the non-core players, right? Like,
Right.
and I think like it shouldn't be, oh, you're staggering them because the core steps on each other's toes, right? That's not really maximal team building. So I definitely agree with you, and it's something that Detroit and the core itself has to figure out, right? It can't just all be on the. And that's not to say that it's a balance, right? So it's on kind of those guys for the next 2 months to figure it out together, and it's on the front office to watch how they play together and make decisions based off of that.
All right, we'll wrap it up there. Thank you, Jackson, so much for coming on the podcast. You guys can find him over on Twitter at JackFrank_JJF. You can find his work over at Basketball Insiders. Again, I want to thank you so much for coming on. I know you're an extremely busy guy. You got a lot of stuff going on, so I appreciate it. Tremendous basketball insight. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe button to the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. Hopefully the Pistons can get fully healthy over All-Star break and we get this full roster after All-Star break. But until the next one, I'll see you guys later. Till then, peace out.